Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace. We want to welcome our friends and guests in South Africa, the United States, and around the world to this week's edition of a conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. I'm pleased to be your host, coming to you once again through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. Inshallah, God willing, today my intent is to have another one-on-one with my faith community and the community at large. This time on the reconstructed legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. through a 21st century lens. There's never been a better time to have a re-examination of this nature than now. Against the backdrop of what we see happening today, locally, nationally, and internationally. In the wake of the U.S. insurrection of January 6, 2021, just 11 days ago, a spectacle that the entire world honed in on. President-elect Joe Biden said, and I quote, "This is not America. This is not who we are." Was he telling the truth? Or was he retelling a worn-out lie? You be the judge. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. After graduating from college with a PhD, he would follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps and become a Christian pastor. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a public figure into the national spotlight in the years 1955 through 56 during what became known as the Montgomery bus boycott. He would later go on to motivate hundreds of thousands to nonviolently protest the evils of white supremacy in America, a disease that's been present in this country since its inception. Dr. King continued utilizing what he called creative nonviolence as a weapon of resistance in the lead up to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963. And while he continued to be an advocate of this form of resistance up until his assassination in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968, there is an abundance of evidence that underscores a dramatic shift in his worldview on the nature of his people's struggle for human rights, and I emphasize human rights, not civil rights, and on the limits of nonviolence as an effective tool within that struggle. Here are a few important markers in the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s public life and legacy. The Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. His August 1963 I Have a Dream speech, followed the very next month by the Sunday, September 15th, bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the very next month. This was the response to the success of the March on Washington, a bombing that took the lives of a number of little black girls in a church, a Sunday school in Birmingham, Alabama. You know, Birmingham, at the height of the civil rights movement, would later become known as Birmingham. Domestic terrorism is not a recent phenomenon on the American landscape. Thirdly, the third marker is his 1967 Riverside Church speech, which we're going to come back to with some selected quotes in a few minutes. I would say that the fourth marker is COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, and the struggle against his own human frailties. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a perfect human being. None of us are. But the FBI discovered extramarital affairs that Dr. King had at one point in his public life, in his private and public life. And they honed in on that and attempted, to the best of their ability, to try to use these affairs not only to shame Dr. King, but in an effort to persuade him to commit suicide. They attempted to extort him. If you don't commit suicide, we will reveal this and show you to be the imposter in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover that he perceived Dr. King as being. Then we have, as the next point, the expansion of his focus from civil rights to human rights, and the price that Dr. King paid as a result. Number 6 on my short list is his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech the night before he was martyred. And then number 7, his martyrdom itself, and the competing campaigns which have ensued since his death to, on one hand, memorialize his legacy, but on the other, to reshape it and defang it from its true revolutionary significance. The systemic goal has been to reassassinate the most vital parts of his legacy. I think it's important for us to examine these markers against the current shutdown in Washington, D.C., in the lead up to a presidential inauguration and the annual national celebration of Dr. King's life and legacy. I should note here that there will be no visits paid to the King Memorial in downtown Washington this year. And it won't be because of threats of violence coming from the community that represented his primary constituency. The Reverend Dr. William Barber correctly noted in a message last year, quote, "If we are to honor and love Martin Luther King, we must be clear about who he was. In this historical moment, we especially need to remember the real Martin Luther King, because there are a lot of false portraits that are being pandered in the public square. Hashtag Martin Luther King Day," end quote. And I couldn't agree more. Reverend Barber's words are even more relevant a year later, in 2021. Now let us proceed with an examination of who the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was through his own words. And I've decided to just restrict myself in terms of the quotations, or I should say the majority of the quotes that we're going to relate from Dr. King's legacy to his Beyond Vietnam speech that was delivered on April 4th, 1967, exactly a year before his assassination at Riverside Church in New York City. Dr. King said, well, before getting into what he said, some of his quotes, I've chosen a few selected quotes from this historic address because, again, you know, the speech for me was the most important of his impressive but all too short human rights career. It's worth noting Dr. King was largely, but not totally, abandoned after he delivered this speech in 1967. He was attacked. He was excoriated in newspapers throughout the country. And some of his closest companions, some of his closest co-activists in the civil rights movement, among the big six, as they called them, and on the periphery of the big six, many of his closest supposedly companions in the civil rights movement, quote unquote, distanced themselves from Dr. King after he delivered this speech, and it received the kind of response that it did from the establishment. One of his quotes was, "I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight, Riverside Church, because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this meeting because I am in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization that brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam." He went on to say, "The recent statements of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. Quote, a time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam." In another quote, he said, "And we must rejoice as well. For surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history." In another quote, "Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix." What an argument to make. Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. "Aren't you hurting the cause of your people?" they ask. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. In the light of such tragic misunderstanding, I deem it of signal importance to state clearly, and I trust concisely, why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight. I come to this platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation. This speech is not addressed to Hanoi or to the National Liberation Front. It is not addressed to China or to Russia. Later in the speech, he went on to say, I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. There is, at the outset, a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. Now, brothers and sisters, let me say here parenthetically, when you listen to the words that I'm about to share from Dr. King himself, let it be against the backdrop of the present war that America is still engaged in, the so-called war on terrorism, and the enormous destruction that it has caused in a number of countries, predominantly Muslim populated countries overseas. Again, he said, there is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program right here in America. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam. And I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything in a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinary high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, supposedly, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. So we watch them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village, but we realize that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. My third reason comes to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. Let that sink in for a moment, because this is still the reality. Regarding the fourth reason, the question was raised, aren't you a civil rights leader? Dr. King's response to this thought-provoking, rhetorical question. Now it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. The fifth reason, and I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize of 1964 was also a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances. Regarding his sixth reason, he said, but even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. And I hope the Christian pastors out there, especially those pastors out there that are so focused on materialism, the Creflo dollars of America. And they come in abundance in all shades. Pay attention to what Dr. King has to say about the ministry of Jesus Christ. He said to me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me, why am I speaking against the war? Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men? Reason number 7, he says, finally, as I try to explain for you and for myself the road that leads from Montgomery to this place in the here and now, Riverside Church in the village of Harlem. I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction that I share with all men, the calling to be a son of the living God, metaphorically speaking. Beyond the calling of race or nation or creed is this vocation of sonship and brotherhood. Because I believe that the Father is deeply concerned, especially for his suffering and helpless and outcast children. I come tonight to speak for them. This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, for those it calls the enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. Later in his speech, he noted, "We are now forced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now." Now, let me share a few uncomfortable truths about America's wars. Actually, just one very uncomfortable truth. According to the Cost of War Project, the Cost of War Project, you can Google them yourself. The estimated cost of America's wars from the onset of Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11 until just a few months ago, it was a staggering $6.4 trillion. Imagine how different this world of ours would be if instead of guns, bombs, profit-driven manipulations, and hate-filled rhetoric, the major thrust of our international exchange, in fact, our national and international exchange, was comprised of the best of each other's culture. Something to think about. As I near the conclusion of this presentation, brothers and sisters, I want to share some more food for thought from Dr. King himself. Um, in the days and weeks leading up to his assassination, shortly before his assassination, because as shocking as this may be for some of us, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lived for 5 years after he delivered "I Have a Dream" in downtown Washington, D.C. That wasn't his final speech. That wasn't the end of his legacy. He lived another 5 years and continued to evolve. One of the things that Dr. King said to one of his closest friends, confidants, was that he feared that he was integrating his people into a burning house. Dr. King said, urban riots, and this is a direct quote, urban riots must now be recognized as durable social phenomena. He said these words during a speech titled The Role of Behavioral Scientists in the Civil Rights Movement. It's part of a dissertation that he delivered at the American Psychology Association's annual convention in Washington, D.C., right here in my backyard on September 1st, 1967. He said, they may be deplored, but they are there and should be understood. He went on to say urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. They are not insurrections like what we saw here in Washington, D.C. just a few days ago. He said they are not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or to attain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. They are a distorted form of social protest. The looting, which is their principal feature, serves many functions. He then added, let us say boldly that if the violations of law, listen closely to this, brothers and sisters, because in the wake of what we saw here in Washington, D.C. just a few days ago, in the wake of that, there have been a lot of false comparisons, a lot of false equivalencies, not just made by well-meaning, but some well-meaning, but woefully uh, uh, uninformed white folk. But there have been false equivalencies made by black and brown folk as well, on the wrong side of history in terms of their analysis. He said, let us say boldly that if the violations of law by the white man in the slums over the years were calculated and compared with the law breaking of a few days of riots, he's talking about the riots back in the 1960s, riots that were often instigated by police brutality. He said the hardened criminal would be the white man. These are often difficult things to say, but I have come to see more and more that it is necessary to utter the truth in order to deal with the great problems that we face in our society. End quote. The actor-activist Harry Belafonte was a very close confidant of Dr. King and was someone who was one of the foremost in helping to finance the movement led by Dr. King. He shared a similar moment about his friend. Harry Belafonte said, and I quote, midway through the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. realized that the struggle for integration would ultimately become a struggle for economic rights. He said, I remember the last time we were together at my home, shortly before he was murdered. He seemed quite agitated and preoccupied, and I asked him what the problem was. According to Belafonte, Dr. King responded, quote, I've come upon something that disturbs me deeply. We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have, and I know we will win. But I have come to believe that we are integrating into a burning house. I'm afraid that America has lost the moral vision she may have had. And I'm afraid that even as we integrate, we are walking into a place that does not understand that this nation needs to be deeply concerned with the plight of the poor and disenfranchised. Until we commit ourselves to ensuring that the underclass is given justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears the soul of this nation. I fear I am integrating my people into a burning house. End quote. Harry Belafonte added, quote, that statement took me aback. It was the last thing I would have expected to hear, considering the nature of our struggle. He then asked King, what should we do? And Dr. King replied, and this was, this was standard King. We should become the firemen, King said. Let us not stand by and let the house burn. Now, brothers and sisters, in my conclusion, I want to share something that I shared, I think it was last year, a short list of recommendations for positive change. As I stated at the beginning, Salam Media is a platform for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. And this principle of nasiha is a foundational principle in Islam. Sincere counsel, sincere advice. So revisiting something that I said last year, I think it was last year. We should bear in mind the state that this country is in and reflect upon the prophetic words of both Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah and Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers. Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah said civilization is based on justice, and the consequences of oppression are devastating. Therefore, it is said, Allah aids the just state, even if it is not Muslim, and withholds his help from the oppressive state, even if it is Muslim. Jefferson said, I tremble for my country. When I reflect God is just, his justice cannot sleep forever. To reach back and revisit an observation made by another founding father, Benjamin Franklin, who was asked at the end of the Constitutional Convention in 1789, if I remember the year correctly. The question was raised, what have you wrought with this Constitution? What have you wrought? It was a question raised by one of the reporters of that age, and his response was, a republic if you can keep it. Republican government is supposed to be the highest form of representative government. And his advice, his response to that query, that inquiry, what have you wrought, was a republic if you can keep it. Yeah, I think it's also Important to note here that that is a reflection of the fact that there have always been two Americas. The America that we project to the world, and the America that is the real America that we project upon the world and upon ourselves. We should reflect, point number 3, on these sterling pearls of reflection coming from the founding fathers of this country. Even though some of them were, in fact, many of them, mired in their own contradictions. Next, we should reflect upon the perpetual war footing the U.S. has been on since its inception. There are very few years in America's history when we were not at war. Some would argue that there was never a time when we were not at war, either with someone else or with ourselves. My 5th point was the ever deepening corporate driven healthcare crisis that this country is in. And this has been greatly magnified, exemplified right now that our nation is in the throes of this global pandemic. It has opened the door for those who are engaged in self-deception. We have the best healthcare system in the world. Yes. It has surely been revealed as otherwise. We must be concerned about the never-ending living wage and affordable housing crisis. Again, another example of our deficiency as a nation that has been revealed to the world as a result of this pandemic. Point number 7, America's impact on the deepening global environmental crisis. Point number 8, the horrific extremism that dominates our nation's social and political discourse. Point number 9, our nation's horrifically inhumane immigration policies. Just last night, I was part of a panel discussion out of New York City on this very issue. Point number 10, as far as the economy is concerned, the American people are being derisively spat upon and being told it's rain. Point number 11, the ever expanding military industrial complex, which has now been appended by a national security complex. Let me end my presentation on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Against or within the lens of 2021, this 21st century that we are now in. Let me conclude with these words. There is a photograph of a constitutional oath-taking congressman giving a fist, a black power fist, in his case, a white power fist, salute to insurrectionists in the nation's capital on January 6th. This is what Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had to say about the photo in a recent tweet. She said, quote, "Hey, Senator at Howley, Missouri. I hate to break it to you, but this is in fact you. And she has the photograph of him giving the salute. You raised your fists in solidarity with white supremacists who attacked our capital. While you may politically regret what you revealed about yourself, you still have no place in public office. Resign. End quote. I agree with AOC. If this could happen on a bright, sunny day in the nation's capital, imagine some of the things that have transpired courtesy of this same mindset in the dark days of the nation's past. To say this is in America, what happened a few days ago, is to engage oneself in a dangerous dance of self-delusion. And as a wise man once said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it again and again and again. Brothers and sisters, this is the end of my presentation for this afternoon, and I just want to say before I leave this platform that your brother Saalakhan has decided to go on a little sabbatical. I am going to stay connected to my social media to the end of today, because I really would like to hear from those of you who saw this broadcast live or will see it via the video before the end of the day, and you might want to share your thoughts. I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about any of the issues raised during this presentation. And this was just a very small capsule presentation on the rich legacy of struggle of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Just a small little nugget. But that's all we had time for in this hour-long program. I'd like to hear from you before I shut down my social media, but I have decided, getting back to the point I wanted to make, to take a little sabbatical. I'm going to shut down after this evening. I'm going to shut it down completely. I'm going to cut off myself from all social media. And right now, I don't know when I'm going to turn it back on, but I'm taking a sabbatical. It's going to be for at least a week to 10 days, at least for that length of time. And inshallah ta'ala, what I plan to do, and the reason why I'm taking the sabbatical is I just really need to rest my soul. I need to rest. I need to rest. I often advise young up-and-coming activists when they ask me for advice on how to be an effective activist. One of the things I mentioned to them is that it's important to pay attention to yourself, to your own well-being. And if you come to a point where you feel you need to take a break, you need to rest yourself, then that's what you should do. Because human rights, it begins at home. It begins with you yourself. And then it expands from there, your family, your community, your nation, your world. But it begins here. If you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of nobody else. So I came to a realization over the past few days that I really need to take a break. I need to take a break. Uh, and so I'm going to take this sabbatical, cut myself completely off from social media, and I will communicate with those who would like to have communication from me and to hear what my perspective is during this sabbatical via our website, afia.org, www.aafia.org. I'm going to post on our website's blog, some perspective on some of the stuff that's going on, my thoughts during this period of mental and spiritual retrenchment. And so if you want to remain connected, and I would also hope that if you read any of what we have to say there, that you will share your thoughts at the in the space allotted for you to be able to respond and to share your thoughts on what we have to say. But this again, later tonight, later this evening, I'm going to shut everything off, everything, including my phone. I'm going to shut that off as well. And every couple of days, I'll check to see if I have any voicemail messages from folk who just need to communicate with me about something. And if there's something really urgent that I need to respond to, I will. But other than that, you will not hear from me. So, I pray to Allah Ta'ala that this sabbatical I'm about to take will be fruitful, that it will allow me to come back stronger, more impactful in the work that we do. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as I always do, that when the time comes for Allah to take my soul, that Allah takes my soul in a state of Islam, in a state of complete surrender to His will. Ameen. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal Asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. Illa ladina amanu wa amalu salihati. Wa tawasaw bil haqq. Wa tawasaw bis sabr. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. By the token of time through the ages, verily humanity is in loss, except those who believe and do good, and exhort one another to truth, and exhort one another to patiently persevere. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.